Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today I am joined by a friend but very distinguished academic, Professor Simon Horobin. Now, Simon is the Professor of English Language and Literature at Magdalen College. Simon, are you talking to us from Magdalen College? Because your background does look very, worthy of Magdalen.
Yeah, no, well spotted. Yeah, I'm sitting in, if you've seen pictures of Lewis in his rooms, I'm in that same building, but just two staircases along from him in a room that's sort of identical to the main sitting room that he had, but it's a kind of mirror image of it. So yeah, that's the background you can see.
So if you're listening to this rather than watching it, there's a beautifully decorated panelled room behind without the smoke stains, which I imagine would have been in Lewis's room. And
here now.
Yeah, big Oxford, it's called the New Building, which means it's extremely old. And one way you look out on the rest of the college, and the other you look out on the deer park. But perhaps we might touch on that a bit later. The reason why Simon is joining us today is because he has just published with the Bodleian Library Publishing Service a wonderful book called C.S. Lewis's Oxford. And it's very much a title that says what it does in the book, because it's all about C.S. Lewis's long history of living in Oxford. But let's start with you, Simon, because you are actually holding the same position in the college as C.S. Lewis held. So, yeah, big shoes to fill. How did you come to be interested in C.S. Lewis? I was wondering about this, having sort of known you for a few years now. I was wondering if it's because you're, in the same role, or was it through your academic career because you teach in a very similar area, the students coming to Oxford now? Or maybe as a child, you read Narnia and went through the wardrobe. Which is it?
It's actually all of those things. But I suppose it starts with reading the Narnia books as a child. I still have the copies that I read, back when I was, I guess, 10 years old. And, that was my introduction to C.S. Lewis. But then sort of slightly less, in a slightly more unusual way of getting into him, I suppose the next things I read were The Allegory of Love, The Discarded Image, which is still one of my favourite Lewis books today, because it's such a great introduction to medieval and Renaissance literature. And I read those when I was a student. And so I already knew Lewis quite well by the time I came to work here at Magdalen. But of course, you can't, sit in the New Building and walk around the college without getting more interested in Lewis and being acutely conscious of his legacy. And also when I arrived, people like the C.S. Lewis Society would write and ask me to come and give a talk. And I remember the first time they did, I wrote back and said, I didn't really know very much about C.S. Lewis. So I thought I'd better find out. And so that is then the sort of next stage. And that I then started looking into more into his biography and to his life specifically at Magdalen. And I guess that's how the book kind of grew out of that experience.
So it is absolutely the perfect book to have on hand if you come to Oxford to visit. If you're a Lewis fan, you've got to get this book. But I don't think you need to be in Oxford to enjoy it. I think it's very enjoyable as a virtual visit through the pages of this book. And it also gives a great insight into Lewis himself. Got a wonderful picture of him on the back in a room very much like the one Simon is currently occupying. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how you decided to structure the book? Because I should also mention it doesn't only deal with Oxford. Just,
no, that's right. Yeah, somewhat controversially, it has a chapter called Cambridge. But then, we can't pretend that he didn't actually go there. But yeah, and partly the structure. So it is structured around, you could do it as a kind of walking tour of Oxford, as you've suggested. And that's partly because during the pandemic, when we could only meet outside in groups, I started doing C.S. Lewis tours for student groups and for others. And so that partly is the origin of the book, is sort of walking people around Magdalen and pointing things out. And then working our way down the high street, and you go past the Eastgate Hotel, which is where Lewis and Tolkien would meet on a Monday morning to read bits of Lord of the Rings or The Great Divorce to each other. And then you go past University College, where Lewis began his academic studies. We always think of him as being at Magdalen, but he started out at what's called Univ as a student of classics. So it's a bit different to, now we think of him as an English tutor. Then he was a classicist, a philosopher. And also you go past Merton College, where Tolkien himself was when they were meeting with each other. And so that kind of, that's sort of the origin of it, and why I thought I would structure it around these places. And it's partly because place is so central to Lewis, because, actually, of course, he spent most of his adult life in Oxford. And even when he went to Cambridge, he didn't really leave Oxford, in the sense that, he commuted and spent term times and weekdays living in college in Cambridge, but he came back to Oxford at weekends. And the places that, like the particularly the pubs, I suppose, are really important. The Eagle and Child has a chapter to itself because of, the Inklings being so associated with it. Those kinds of institutions, places, and of course the people that he encounters and meets there just seem to me so central to what makes Lewis Lewis, to his writing and his thinking.
Just so if you've not been to Oxford, people might not realise just how close those places are. So when Simon's talking about going past Eastgate Hotel and then Univ, we are talking about a minute walk up one. It's really, really close. A very densely important set of locations for Oxford. And for our Northern Ireland listeners, we should mention that Northern Ireland does get a mention too, because we shouldn't forget that you never really took the Northern Irish out of C.S. Lewis either. Did even being in Oxford, he retained a strong connection with his place of birth. So when I was reading this, having lived in Oxford for decades and knowing the places, so I was able to sort of follow it very, very closely. But the one thing which was new to me and new to all the biographies I've read of C.S. Lewis was the college details of Magdalen. Now, I was actually a Magdalen postgrad for a few years when I was doing my doctorate, but I didn't get to know it in the same way as you as a professor do. And I felt reading this section, it could only be written by an insider. So do you want to mention some of the odd little things about the Magdalen experience? And perhaps you might want to go on to talk about whether or not, what's the same and what's changed in Magdalen since C.S. Lewis's time, bearing in mind someone listening to this might be thinking to apply in future. We don't want to put them off.
No, I think that's right. And I think that's partly what spurred me to write the book, is that, there are many excellent biographies of C.S. Lewis. And so it only makes sense to write something where I feel that there's something I could add to that. And I think you're right that having that college angle, sitting in a room just like his, and, sort of teaching in the way that he taught, the course that he taught more or less, and going around the various parts of the college did give me a kind of an insider's view of what that was like. And some of the weird kinds of traditions that, that actually still go on today. He talks in Surprised by Joy about the moment that he became a fellow here in 1925 and how strange it was. He found it when he was lining up in the president's lodgings, and then he had the kind of the Latin admission ceremony, and then went round and shook the hands of all of the fellows at the time, who all said, "I wish you joy," to which he made no reply. And of course, that was very significant for him, because the word joy already had an importance for him, which it then took on even greater significance. And, for a number of reasons, Surprised by Joy is obviously one, Joy Davidman another. But, that strangeness of that ceremony, well, that's exactly the ceremony that I went through when I came here as a fellow 18 years ago. So there are all these connections, and there are some nice kind of objects that are still around in the archives, which which I talk about in the book. So, for instance, we still use the college weighing scales on special dinners where guests who come to dinner are given the option. Not so many people take it up these days, of being weighed. I don't know if that was active in your day, Julia, but
well, I was having a child at the time, having my daughter Lucy, so I was having enough weighing at the clinic,
because it is something that happens at graduate dinners, but yeah, so he appears in the college weights book. Somewhat unfortunately for Lewis, he appears sort of early on in his time here at Magdalen, and then just before he left for Cambridge in 1954. So you can exactly work out how much weight he put on during the period he was here. So there's that kind of thing. There's also the college betting book, which again is still active in the SCR, where fellows might fall out over some sort of abstruse fact and decide that because they can't decide who's right, they're going to stake a bottle of port on the outcome of it. And there's an entry by Lewis in the college betting book where he's had a wager with C.E. Stevens, the ancient history tutor, about whether the word eros appears in Homer's Odyssey, and they stake a bottle of port on the outcome. And of course, Lewis turns out to be the correct and wins the bottle. But these kind of quaint traditions that are still active today, but we can sort of trace them back to Lewis's day and see him taking part in them.
I think the thing to emphasize is how masculine the environment was in his day compared to now. I mean, obviously I was there years ago. It would changed. I don't know when it went mixed, in the 80s, maybe? When did? In
the 70s. But yeah, exactly what I was going to say is that the big change between Lewis's day and today is, I think, the admission of women. This was a very exclusively male world in Lewis's time. Although one of the things that I found which had surprised me really was how many female students he taught. And that's partly because going through the archives of a number of the women's colleges, I found references to him being paid for tuition or writing reports on students. And that was particularly during the Second World War, where lots of the male students, of course, were not here, but also, before that as well. So although it was particularly a male-dominated world, there were women students in the college, in the ladies' colleges, and they did come in pairs rather than singly, because of course Lewis, they needed to be chaperoned, and but he did actually teach women as well.
You have a chapter on Somerville College, and you mentioned Dorothy L. Sayers. So I think one of the things that strikes me about C.S. Lewis, compared to Tolkien, who often people say there's a lack of women in Tolkien's, well, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, I think, rather than the Silmarillion. You don't see the same thing so much in the Narnia stories, where you've got girls as heroes as well. Mm-hmm. And I think with what you're saying about the contact with female students, but also his home life, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about Headington, which is now a suburb of Oxford. So people would refer to it in the same breath as Oxford, but back in the day would feel like more of a countryside destination where he had his house, the Kilns. But he lived in a house of women.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, again, also, then we think of it as a suburb and quite a well-to-do suburb of Oxford. And when Lewis began living in Headington with Mrs. Moore, before they bought the Kilns, it was striking to me what a kind of transient life they led, sort of subletting individual rooms with Lewis sleeping on the sofa. And, it was really quite a primitive existence to begin with. And then, of course, in 1930, they bought the house that Lewis then lived in for the rest of his life, which was, as you say, really quite a sort of rural kind of countryside location with a huge grounds, which is now what's called the C.S. Lewis Nature Reserve. So you don't really get quite the sense of how big the surrounding area was. A huge lake which Lewis used to skate on when it iced over, and a big wood where Joy Davidman would go shooting pigeons and things. And so it was like living in the countryside. And actually, he was a great lover of animals, and they had a real menagerie of various kinds when they lived there. But you're right that he lived there with Mrs. Moore, the mother of his of Paddy Moore that he served with during the First World War, but who was killed, and her daughter Maureen. So it was quite a female household. But it's interesting to me as well the extent to which he was living at the Kilns, but also living in college. He was obviously splitting his time in a way that nowadays you either would live in or live out. In those days, I think you could kind of move between the two worlds, so that he spent so many evenings in college doing various kinds of societies. We know about the Inklings meeting on a Thursday night in his rooms here in Magdalen. But, every night he was doing something similar. It was incredible. So he would quite often sleep over during the week in term time, go back at weekends, and then probably spend most of the vacations living in the Kilns.
That's one of the elements I hadn't really clocked, because it's a short distance, but if you miss the bus, it's a long way. And so if you're late chatting into midnight with the Inklings, you aren't going to get home. Tolkien could always cycle back home because his house was in the sort of central Oxford itself. But Lewis, of course, he would have to stay over. One of the things that you reminded me of when I was reading it is how when Lewis starts his academic career in the 20s, well, coming out of the war, actually, he's considering himself, his ambition is to be a poet. And that's really what he wanted to excel at. And you have a beautiful poem about Oxford. I don't know if you want to read a little bit, if you've got it to hand.
Sure, yeah. I've got it here in my copy because I printed it at the beginning of the book. And it's a poem that he wrote during the war when he was actually, on the front line in the trenches. And I find it very poignant because he, of course, started his Oxford career in April 1917, so during the war, but he didn't really ever get properly started. He mostly was just doing some training with the Oxford Cadet Corps. Then he goes off to Keble College and starts, training properly with the Somerset Light Infantry. And then by November of that year, his 19th birthday, he finds himself in France on the front line. But he has had, at that point, a kind of glimpse of what Oxford could offer, but it's already been taken away from him. And he's sort of obviously looking at, what he hopes is lying ahead of him in the future. So how much of this would you like me to read?
I think if you read the first verse and then the last verse, that will give a sense of his relationship to Oxford.
Okay. It is well that there are palaces of peace and discipline and dreaming and desire, lest we forget our heritage and cease the Spirit's work to hunger and aspire. She was not builded out of common stone, but out of all men's yearning and all prayer that she might live eternally our own, the Spirit's stronghold, barred against despair.
So in a way, Oxford is everything the war isn't,
Exactly.
So it's a very important place to him. This is before he was obviously had his conversion. It's a spiritual experience for him being in Oxford, in a non-Christian sense. But obviously that then got even more special when he became a Christian in, was it 1931, as a result of meeting people here. So when you were doing your research, it sounds like you've been snooping around all the archives of all the colleges. Is there anything that really surprised you, or an odd little thing that you found out that you had no idea had gone on at the time? For me, the fact that I sort of took away is the image of C.S. Lewis sitting on the bus, going up the hill, Headington Hill, leaving Oxford for the countryside. I sort of knew that, but reading this again, I reckon that transition from one place to another was very important to him in his understanding of his own life and his creativity and relationship to Oxford. So that's my takeaway, is the bus journey, quite nice and practical.
Well, and of course, there's a moment in Surprised by Joy where he talks about that exact bus journey, isn't there? I mean, and you think of it as such a kind of quotidian, sort of ordinary kind of experience. But for Lewis, quite often those are the moments where he has these great spiritual insights when he talks about, suddenly I found myself having to confront the reality of, whether to, well, and again, interestingly, in quite Narnian terms, he says, I needed to decide whether to open the door or leave it closed. It's a moment of sudden crisis in his deciding whether to accept the Christian faith or not. And it happens on that bus going up Headington Hill. So I think that is a significant feature of his life. I think one of the things that I was really struck by was the sheer workload, because, we think about how much he was so productive, and it's tempting to imagine that were quite leisurely days as an Oxford academic. And now obviously we have lots of committees and we have to do kinds of different sort of paperwork and reporting and so on. But the amount of tutorial teaching he was doing, I've already mentioned the women's colleges, but, he left Univ when he came here in 1925 he was the college's, Magdalen's first English tutor, because it's a relatively new subject. And he carried on teaching the English students at Univ for the next kind of at least 15 years, alongside all of those students here at Magdalen. And also he was teaching at New College as well as at the ladies' colleges. And, he said that he comes here as an English tutor, but, his training was in classics and particularly in philosophy. And as a result, he was asked to teach the philosophers at Magdalen, which he did. And I also found he was teaching the historians as well. So he had an immense teaching load. And then, you have to remember in those days, this is one-on-one tutorial teaching. So there's no sense in which you're sort of doubling them up or having classes or... So that was something that struck me, was that just how did he fit everything in? And the other sort of nice discovery, so say I'm snooping around the archives, one thing that I was really struck by was that when he arrived at Magdalen, there was a ban on any student clubs and societies, the very thing that we associate him with, because the president felt that they were interfering with more important pursuits like rowing. And
that's not a club.
Yeah. And so Lewis felt that this was somehow the wrong way round. And he and one of the history tutors, KB Macfarlane, set up a thing called the Michaelmas Club. And it was a sort of literary philosophical discussion group, which is obviously in keeping with lots of things that Lewis was actively engaged in at the time. And in fact, he gave papers at it himself. And then other students spoke at the events. And then they decided after a few years to have some invited speakers from outside the college. And one of them, again, this is not surprising, but one of them was Tolkien, and came and gave a paper on constructed languages. And there's a lovely little account in the minute book of this event. And it says that Professor Tolkien came and spoke to us. He talked about the origins of constructed languages. He traces it back to Animalic and some of these early languages that he was involved in as a child. He then gave some polished philologies of his own and read poems in those languages. And it was only after I sort of read that account that I realized, looking at the date of it, that what this is an early version of what becomes a secret vice. Early in the sense that, we think of Secret Vice being the first time that Tolkien ever talked about his construction of his own languages and shared some of the poetry that he'd written in them. But actually, this event at Magdalen, which happened in June 1930, predates that by about a year and a half. And so that was a really surprising find. Not surprising, I suppose, in some ways, because you might think that the first time that he talked about all of these things would be with C.S. Lewis. And so in that sense, it was in keeping. But it just amazed me that this document was sitting there in the college archives and nobody had ever really put those two connections together. And very frustratingly, though, the student who wrote the account of it, you'd like to have heard a lot more about this. But he says, unfortunately, because I had an exam the next morning, I had to leave early. And so I couldn't stay for the rest of the discussion. So we never quite find out, what exactly was said afterwards.
Oh, that is a shame, isn't it? Lost to history. You did mention earlier on that in some ways Lewis's career reached a blockade in Oxford. And so he actually got his chair over a professorship chair over in the other Magdalen in Cambridge. When you were thinking about this, what did you having got your Magdalen Oxford experience and then looking at Magdalen Cambridge, what do you think of the two experiences as far as Lewis is concerned? To the outsider, they seem very similar cities, but insiders might think actually they're quite different, certainly as colleges.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Lewis says himself that Magdalen Cambridge was much smaller than Magdalen Oxford. And he found it quite a congenial change in that sense. It was smaller, it was friendlier. I think by the time that he'd spent nearly 30 years at Magdalen Oxford, he had a lot of long-standing friends, but he also had some enemies. And by the time he'd become a very successful sort of public apologist for the Christian faith, I think he had his admirers, but he had his detractors. And I think moving to Magdalen Cambridge, where it just seemed homelier, friendlier, and also he says they were much less hostile to the Christian faith. He talks about Magdalen the impenitent from Magdalen Oxford, and so I think he felt under sort of that it wasn't an entirely congenial environment for him by that stage. But also switching jobs, they may sound to outsiders like very similar things, and you might wonder why you'd move from one to the other. But the distinction was much clearer in those days, and that's to say that he was always Mr. Lewis in Oxford. And it wasn't just about getting the title. They are different jobs in the sense that a tutorial fellow is responsible for doing all of these tutorials, these one-on-one meetings with students going through their essays. And it's very time consuming. And as I've said, he did a lot of tutorial teaching, whereas a professor gave a number of lectures, and that was all of their duties. Otherwise, it's mostly research and graduate teaching. Well, Lewis wasn't a big fan of graduate teaching. That's fair to say. He didn't think that research degrees were a worthwhile thing. You should just carry on reading more. But, the idea of just lecturing and not having to do tutorials was obviously appealing to him. And in fact, he says after he's made the move that, I've never had so much free time since I was at school. It's like getting twice the money for half the work. And so I think it made a big difference to him in that way. And I think he also talks about Cambridge as being like a sort of county town. You can walk out from Cambridge and find yourself in the countryside very quickly. And he'd certainly got a bit fed up with the way that Headington, we've talked about it as being in the countryside, but by the time he moved to Cambridge, it was becoming much more suburban. Yeah. And it was a big Cowley car factory and all of the workers' houses that were being built all around where he is. I mean, now, of course, there's a huge ring road that goes right past his front door. And I think in that sense, he felt that the Oxfordshire countryside was being spoilt and that Cambridge had still preserved it. So he seems to have very much enjoyed that elements of that switch. But as I say, he never actually moved to Cambridge. It was just a kind of place that he lived during term time.
I'll save this pleasure for people when they get to read it, but you're very funny about C.S. Lewis's experience of being a college administrator. He takes, what's the name of the role that he took on at the goodness of his heart and was hopeless at?
Yeah, the vice president.
There we go. I found that very funny. He was completely in above his head, but being very sort of responsible. He felt he had to do it when his admin wasn't his skill.
No, and I love the fact that when he goes to Cambridge, and they suggest, because one of the duties of a professor is that you are required to take on the duties of head of department if you're asked to do it. And so immediately they ask him to do it. And he says, no, this has been tried before. It was a disaster.
Oh, yes. But anyway, we all can think that his time might have been better spent rather than doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Many people listening to this will be trying their hand at writing fantasy. What in your research did you learn about Oxford? It's coming back to Oxford from Cambridge. What did you learn about Oxford infiltrating into his fantasy imagination? Because you and I both know, walking around Oxford, you'll hear the tour guide saying, yes, and this little carving here definitely inspired the faun, and this one inspired Aslan, and so on. Was there something else that you found in Oxford that was feeding into his fiction?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually, having just been talking about Cambridge, I mean, Oxford's full of fantasy writers in the past and present, but is Cambridge? I don't know. You probably know better than me. But
it's got quite a few poets, and the current generation, there's a lot of nature writers there. Robert McFarlane, I think, is based there, isn't he?
Yeah.
It doesn't have quite this, and scientists, with Newton and Cavendish labs and things. So, but they don't have the hotspots of Lewis Carroll, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Diana Wynne Jones, Philip Pullman, and so on. So one thing Cambridge will have to cede to Oxford, I think.
Exactly, and it does make one wonder, what is it about Oxford that's so conducive to fantasy writing? And there's that lovely essay by Philip Pullman where he sort of suggests that maybe it's something to do with the fog coming off the rivers that have this kind of solvent effect on reality, and or the gargoyles coming down at night from New College Tower and having a fight with the gargoyles from Magdalen, and all of this, and it is tempting to think that the buildings, the place, inspire much of this kind of fantastical imagining. And I walked past that little doorway the other day in St Mary's Passage, where you always see a group of tourists, and so I sort of listened to see what they were saying, and it is that standard story always that Lewis is coming out of the church and he sees the doorway and there's the faun and there's the lion's head and so on. But the reality is, of course, that the actual images that lie behind the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Lewis tells us, go back to when he was a school child. And he had the image of a faun in a wood, surrounded by snow, holding some brown paper parcels. So, I don't think we can actually sort of, there are lampposts all over Oxford that we want to claim as being the original for Lantern Waste and so on. But I think we're probably going about it the wrong way, looking to find a specific landmark or something that's influenced Lewis. Although, of course, walking around Magdalen and seeing all the stone statues of these strange mythological beasts, you can't help but think of, or is it the White Witch that's turned them to stone? And, it's the white stag that we currently have in the Deer Park and so on. There's so many Narnian touch points in Oxford. But I suppose the conclusion I came to, having sort of thought about all these things, is that actually what really links Oxford with Lewis's fantastical worlds is the literature that he was reading as part of his studies and teaching as part of his academic job. Because, of course, Narnia in particular is so influenced by such a huge variety of literary works, especially classical and medieval ones, in which he was completely immersed. And so that seems to me to be key to it. And also the fact that he came into contact with people like Tolkien, who were also interested in the same thing, and that they had the libraries that sort of furnished them with these books, but also places like colleges where they could meet in the SCRs and at high-table dinners, or the pubs like the Eagle and Child and the Eastgate, where they could sit and talk. That's really what I think Oxford is doing. It's providing the people and the place within which they can sort of come together and feed from each other's shared interests and respond to each other's criticisms and provocations and inspirations and so on.
It may be something to do with the historic construction of the English syllabus as well, because the Oxford one sort of gave priority to the early stuff, the Anglo-Saxon and medieval, which, if you think about it, is largely fantasy stories.
Yeah.
Whereas Cambridge, certainly towards the end of his life, is all caught up in the debates about literary criticism and how you read texts, and much more a sort of philosophy of criticism interest there, which is antithesis of interest in story. And so I sometimes wonder if it's that's also going on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think Lewis found that when he moved to Cambridge and of course, Anglo-Saxon isn't part of English studies at all in Cambridge. It's part of a different department, Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic. And I think that Lewis found odd. And also, the study of what he calls literary criticism with the biggest possible capitals for both words, which, I think he didn't have a lot of time for that kind of theory. And that was very much at the forefront in Cambridge. So I would agree with that. And, the sort of the submersion in, story is exactly what Lewis is all about, isn't it? Like that's it. If he is interested in theory, it's in what makes a good story. I agree.
So if you're thinking of a good Christmas gift for a C.S. Lewis fan in your life, or to put on your own list, C.S. Lewis's Oxford is definitely well worth a look. It's beautifully produced, lots of pictures, which I always love, really beautiful ones. So I highly recommend it. And we'll put a link in our show notes so that you can click your way through to finding it. So Simon, thank you for your time. But just before we send you back into teaching your undergraduates, we always end with where in all the fantasy world is the best place for something. We've gone to the best pub. We've gone to, when we've been different kinds of people, like best assassin, that kind of thing. But I thought in honor of C.S. Lewis, we should have where is the best place to go through a wardrobe, which is slightly different because our wardrobe doesn't just go to Narnia. It can go to any fantasy world whatsoever. So imagine there's a wardrobe in your office that you can walk through into any fantasy world. We'll allow it to always go to Narnia as well occasionally. But if it's going somewhere else, where would you like to go in terms of a fantasy world to visit? As a professor of English language and literature.
It's going to sound a bit predictable, but I would want to go to Middle Earth. Specifically for the reason you've just given, because of course so much of that is, again, like Lewis, like Narnia, built out of medieval, but particularly sort of philological things that I'm interested in. So, the sort of, the fact that Orthanc comes out of Orthanc enter Yeweorc, the cunning work of giants from an Old English poem, makes me just want to go and see it. And so it's those specific connections, and also the fact that, the riders of Rohan actually speak Old English.
You do well there, wouldn't you?
Where's the Theod and Harl? I could converse with them. That would be fun. But I feel like it might be a bit controversial because, of course, Narnia you can kind of dip in and out of through these portals like wardrobes. But of course, Middle Earth isn't really like that. It's not a place that you kind of portal in and out of. So I don't know how they would take me.
It's special dispensation.
Okay, that's good.
For Magdalen. In answer to my own question, I think I'm going to stick with C.S. Lewis actually, but I'd switch to his space trilogy. I'd quite like to visit temporarily and not for a long period of time his version of Perelandra, Venus, because the descriptions of that are so amazing. I would just love to go and see it. The way he imagines this place that almost has no solidity to it. Not the real one, because if I went to the real one, I would just die. But his one, as he imagined it, I think would be really fascinating. But I would be coming quickly back through the wardrobe because I think it's only for a short-term visit, that one. Thank you so much, Simon. And thank you very much for writing this book, which I'm certainly going to treasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.